M. G. Vassanji's The Gunny Sack, 1989, is a richly layered, semi-autobiographical novel that explores identity, memory, diaspora, and post-colonial legacy through the voice of a narrator, Salim Juma. Set against the historical backdrop of East Africa and tracing roots back to India, the novel intricately weaves the personal and the political to chart the journey of a South Asian family over generations. The central metaphor of the gunny sack, a worn-out bag filled with relics and memories, symbolizes the burden of history and the diasporic condition, serving as a trigger for storytelling and reflection. The narrative frame and structure. The novel opens with the death of Salim's great-aunt, Bai, a matriarchal figure who leaves behind an old gunny sack filled with family heirlooms, letters, and miscellaneous objects. This gunny sack becomes the catalyst for Salim's excavation of his family's past. As he sorts through its contents, each item evokes a memory or story, leading to a non-linear, multi-generational narrative spanning India, Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, and other East African locales. The novel is structured as a narrative memoir. Salim recounts his family history from the migration of his ancestors from India to East Africa during the colonial era, through independence movements, the rise of nationalism, and finally into the uncertainties of post-colonial existence. His recollections are introspective and often unreliable, blurring the line between memory and history. The generational storyline. The family's story begins with Vassanji Govindji, Salim's great-grandfather, a merchant from Gujarat, India, who migrates to Zanzibar in the late 19th century during British colonial rule. This initial movement highlights the early economic ambitions and enterprising spirit of the Indian diaspora. Vassanji builds a business empire in the coastal towns of East Africa, marrying into a local family and thus blending cultures, but also planting seeds of tension regarding identity and belonging. Vassanji's son, Juma, takes over the business but faces setbacks, especially as colonial structures begin to shift and nationalist movements rise. Juma is portrayed as a man caught between tradition and change, seeking prosperity while failing to secure a strong legacy. His son Ismail, Salim's father, represents the third generation, a more assimilated, Western-educated man who struggles to reconcile the past with the modern realities of a newly independent East Africa. Finally, Salim, the narrator, is the representative of the fourth generation. He is alienated from both the ancestral Indian roots and the African nation he inhabits. His life is marked by a sense of rootlessness and existential dislocation. He moves to Canada, continuing the diasporic drift that defines the family's story. Themes and analysis. 1. Diaspora and identity. At its core, The Gunny Sack is a meditation on the diasporic condition. Vassanji, himself of Indian Tanzanian origin and living in Canada, uses Salim's fragmented narrative to explore the identity crisis experienced by diasporic individuals. The Indian community in East Africa is portrayed as perpetually in between, neither fully African nor fully Indian, often excluded by both. Salim's journey is a search for self in the midst of cultural hybridity. His narration is riddled with self-doubt and existential inquiry, suggesting the fractured identity that comes from living across multiple worlds. This complex identity is not simply a matter of ethnicity or nationality but is tied to language, memory, religion, and history. 2. Memory, history, and the unreliable narrator. The titular gunny sack is both literal and symbolic. It contains physical remnants of the past, old photographs, trinkets, and letters that prompt Salim's storytelling. However, the bag is also a metaphor for the emotional baggage and fragmented memories that characterize post-colonial and diasporic identities. Salim often admits to gaps in his knowledge, conjectures in his recollections, and an inability to distinguish truth from legend. This narrative technique foregrounds the unreliability of memory and highlights how personal and communal histories are constructed, not merely recalled. By questioning historical truth, Vassanji challenges colonial and nationalist grand narratives, offering instead a more intimate, pluralistic version of history, one shaped by migration, trade, love, betrayal, and forgetting. 3. Colonialism and post-colonial transition. Colonial history underpins much of the novel's setting. The migration of Vassanji to East Africa is part of the larger colonial enterprise that brought Indian merchants and laborers to the continent. The novel traces how this community gained economic privilege under British rule but was socially marginalized. The transition to post-colonialism brings both hope and disillusionment. Nationalist movements offer the promise of African self-determination but also usher in a period of ethnic nationalism that marginalizes the Indian community. Salim and others feel increasingly alienated as foreigners in a land where their families have lived for generations. The novel captures the anxiety of this liminal moment, where colonial legacies still haunt, and the future is fraught with instability. The political backdrop includes references to Idi Amin's expulsion of Asians from Uganda, the Africanization policies of newly independent governments, and the complex racial hierarchies that persist in post-colonial states. 4. Gender and matrilineal memory. While the patriarchs, Vassanji, Juma, Ismail, are central to the family's economic and political fortunes, it is Bai, the elderly matriarch, who becomes the moral and emotional anchor of the story. Her death sets off the process of remembering, and her symbolic presence permeates Salim's recollections. Women in the novel are often the silent bearers of tradition and memory. Though they are less vocal in public life, their roles as caregivers, guardians of heritage, and transmitters of cultural values are central. The female presence in the narrative, especially through Bai and other unnamed maternal figures, complicates the male-dominated historical record and asserts the importance of matrilineal legacy. 5. Belonging and displacement. The novel powerfully portrays the feeling of not belonging anywhere. Salim is estranged from the land of his ancestors, India, unaccepted in the land of his birth, East Africa, and perpetually foreign in his new home, Canada. This global dislocation is emblematic of a larger post-colonial diaspora that must negotiate belonging in a fragmented world. Vassanji suggests that perhaps the only place where one can belong is memory itself. Through storytelling and remembrance, Salim seeks not a homeland in space but a sense of coherence in time. The Gunny sack becomes the vessel of that internal geography. Symbolism. The Gunny sack. Central to the novel's symbolism, it represents history, memory, and the burden of the past. It is worn, stitched, and heavy, just like the legacies the narrator carries. Its contents trigger stories but also evoke guilt, loss, and longing. Letters and photographs serve as tangible connections to an irretrievable past. They represent the fragility and selectivity of memory. Migration is both literal and symbolic. The characters' physical movement from India to Africa to the West mirrors their emotional and cultural drift. Narrative technique. Vassanji employs a non-linear, fragmented narrative voice, reflecting the disjointedness of diasporic memory. Salim is a self-conscious narrator, aware of the gaps in his story. This postmodern storytelling resists closure and definitive interpretation, urging readers to question the authority of memory and history. Conclusion. The Gunny sack is a poignant, multi-generational narrative that captures the essence of diasporic existence, its rootlessness, hybridity, and haunting memory. Through Salim Juma's introspective journey, Vassanji addresses the larger questions of who we are, where we come from, and how we carry our histories. Blending personal narrative with historical reflection, the novel becomes both a family saga and a critique of the colonial post-colonial world system. In the end, the novel suggests that while we may never find absolute belonging in geography or nationhood, we can construct meaning through the act of remembrance. The Gunny sack, full of fragments and whispers, teaches that identity is not about purity or origin, but about piecing together the stories we inherit and the truths we choose to tell.